Hello again and welcome to Amiga Reviews. I'm the eager Amiga Eagle. Can you keep a secret? Today I'm going to be taking a look at Gremlin Graphics' Lotus Turbo Challenge Trilogy. So, time to buckle your seatbelt, shift into high gear and... God, who wrote this script? Lotus Turbo Challenge was originally released in 1990, in a time before the almighty Polygon reigned supreme. Back then, driving games either mostly consisted of 2D drop-down affairs such as Super Off-Road and Power Drive, or a flat representation of the back of your car and a shed load of sprite scaling in games like Road Blasters, Outrun, or my personal favourite, Chase HQ. Man, I love me some Chase HQ. Aside from the fact that most of the car games were simply race from checkpoint to checkpoint, Chase HQ had a point. Ram criminals off the road. Hell yeah! But it also had some of the most luscious graphics that I'd ever seen in a driving game. I coveted Chase HQ like nothing else, and looked forward to the day I could play it at home on my C64. It could handle it, right? Oh god no, it couldn't. It really couldn't. And neither could any other home systems. They were all absolutely awful. There were other racing games that were okay, but I wanted that slick gameplay of the Chase HQ arcade. I had to wait a few years because the Amiga was launched in the late 80s and I didn't get mine until the early 90s. I had already seen Chase HQ on there and it looked a little bit better than the C64, but still nothing like the arcade. Then a year later, Lotus Turbo Challenge dropped and it looked fairly sweet. But it wasn't until I received a copy of Lotus 2 for Christmas that I really came to realise just how close the gameplay was to good old Chase. Lotus 2 was so good that I was happy to return to stage racing rather than bashing other cars in. If you are coming into Lotus Turbo Challenge expecting a Gran Turismo roster of cars, you're going to be quite disappointed. It's all in the name. The only car you get to choose is a Lotus Esprit from the late 80s. All of the other cars in the game are also Lotus Esprits from the late 80s. This is quite unusual because there was no sponsorship deal or endorsement given by Lotus as far as I know. The game's intro goes into a lot of detail about the old Esprit, even including a rudimentary 3D rotating model, which looks kinda cool at the time, but you are not here for all the ins and outs of the car unless you're a completely hopeless petrolhead. After selecting the relevant options, including music on the well-realised Lotus in-car stereo, you are brought to your car on the track. The gameplay is very responsive, and the tracks are relatively easy to follow. Once you've done a few laps, you know where you're going. This was long before the days of the internet, so multiplayer was achieved by the tried and tested method of split screen. Half of the TV's real estate, but twice the fun, in theory. The main problem with Lotus Turbo Challenge is that even in one player, you only get half of the screen. The rest is taken up by some random mechanics working on a reasonably well-drawn Lotus. That smacks just a little of either lack of programming knowledge or laziness. Lotus Turbo Challenge is a lap-based circuit racing game, and you are pitted against a roster of other Lotus Esprit drivers. There are a plethora of tracks, but there is not much variation in the scenery. The only way you know you're on a different track is by the colour of the track borders, the background and the occasional road hazard. This means that there is not much to see in the game itself. I also find the mechanics working on the lower half of the screen very distracting. You have to race quite strategically, because you only have a certain amount of fuel. If you run out, it's an automatic loss, but refuelling takes time, so you only really need to splash and dash when you can. Hitting other cars and trackside obstacles also slows you to a virtual stop, wasting time and fuel. The music is very typical of what you'd expect from early Amiga games, almost exclusively sampled and a little rough around the edges. It's okay, but after having to listen to each track, it gets a little samey after a while. Thankfully, you can race with just the sound effects if it gets too much. All in all, Lotus Turbo Challenge is a good introduction to the franchise, but it positively pales in comparison to its sequel. Following on from Turbo Challenge 1 year later, Lotus Turbo Challenge 2 improves on LTT in virtually every way. Now this is where it's at for me. Lotus Turbo Challenge 2 changes up the format from circuit racer to stage racer, does away with the fuel limit in place of a time limit, and now it does not matter which place you come in. All of the other cars are just there to get in the way. They have improved the roster of cars by 100% over the first game. You now get 2 cars. However, you cannot select which car you use, as it alternates between the Lotus Esprit from the first game and the Lotus Elan each stage. All of the other cars on the track are also the same as yours. Most of the elements of the game are the same. The look of the cars and stages, the engine and sound effects, and the physics. However, everything just feels smoother. I love the fact it's now a stage racer. As long as you beat the time limit, you win. The stages are also a lot more varied, and there are characteristics which set them apart, such as less grip but faster steering on the Arctic stage, floods and watery borders on the rain stage, traffic coming in the opposite way on the motorway stage, reduced visibility on the fog stage, and so on. There are only 8 stages in total, but they are so well realised that driving them seldom becomes boring. Plus, single player is now full screen! Huzzah! By far and away the most impressive track is the motorway course, which has the password Liverpool. Possible clue to where it's set? There are cars coming in the opposite direction on half of the track, as well as the ability to go under the trailers of trucks driving over crossroads, with the triumphant when you do. Then there is the music, which is absolutely top notch and a vast improvement over the first game. The main theme tune is a total earworm, and another one of those which has been countlessly remixed by those with the skill. From the very first beat of the intro, you know what you're playing. Interestingly, there is an attempt to stop people pirating the game with the addition of a subliminal message telling the user that
you will not copy this page.
Suffice to say, it didn't work. This time there is no music during the levels, but each track has its own unique track during loading. These are very thematic, lending themselves to the level they are representing perfectly. Plus, the bird samples on the first stage will have you smiling right away. This is a totally feel-good game. It doesn't matter if the time runs out, because playing the tracks is always a joy. However, there is a cheat that stops the timer from counting down, so you can also just enjoy driving the tracks unencumbered by a pesky time limit. The strangest addition in the game comes in the last 2 stages in the form of extra time bonus and turbo respectively. These are odd, because they look like arcade game buttons placed in the road. Still, hitting them causes the narrator's very well sampled voice to call out Turbo! And you get this very strange feeling of euphoria. When you get to the end, there is nothing more than the scoreboard, but another amazing tune greets your ears at the same time. As far as 2D driving games go, it doesn't get much better than this. Even multiplayer was improved manyfold in Lotus 2. Along with the usual 2-player split screen, you could connect to another Amiga for 2 players with full screen, or up to 4 players split screen. Lotus 2 also came out on the Atari ST, and it was actually possible to connect an Amiga and an Atari ST together for multiplayer, possibly making this one of the first ever cross-platform multiplayer games. Although, I feel sorry for the person who had to play the ST version. Bizarrely, there's also a hidden game in Lotus 2, which is accessed by entering DUX into the password field and selecting Go. Don't get too excited though, Lotus 2 comes on one disc, and the hidden game is actually a very, very low-tech duck shooting game. This should hold your attention at least until the end of this sentence. Finally, rounding out the trilogy is Lotus Turbo Challenge 3, otherwise known as Lotus 3, the Ultimate Challenge. Again, more improvements have been made over the previous two entries, but for some reason, the game itself is not. More on this later. Once again, the roster of cars has grown, as 3 cars are now available. The 2 cars from the previous instalment are joined by a prototype known as the M200, which is closely based on the Elan. Designing this car for the game was not exactly a mammoth task. The main improvement here is that you can now, finally, choose the car that you want to drive. Wow! There are a lot of elements that have been lifted from Lotus 2 appearing in the game, so there is a lot of familiarity for us, and an easier job for the programmer. My main complaint is that some of the tracks are weird, like they don't belong. The first track you race in single player is set in the far future, with huge swathes of speed boosting sections of the track, as well as lasers slowing the car down. But after this, you are back to tracks that are very similar to Lotus 2. There is also a primitive track building editor built into the game. This is possibly the biggest draw in Lotus 3, as you can create tracks and using a password system, create your own multi-track race. Again, like Lotus 2, there is a hidden game in Lotus 3, as if they hadn't ripped enough ideas from the second iteration. However, when I tried to play it, in traditional Amiga style, it crashed. Now, I have a theory about games from around this time. If they were a trilogy, they follow a similar formula, which is this: the second is usually the best. The first edition of the franchise is usually a little rough around the edges, but shows promise. The graphical artists and programmers are just starting to get their heads around the game concept. It usually looks and plays reasonably, and is for the most part, a good game. Now the sequel. This is where the franchise hits its stride. It is considerably more polished than the first game. Graphics, playability, music, and general game identity are all top notch. Then there is the third edition. Usually an improvement over the other two, but it's starting to feel like they're trying too hard. The first game is the proof of concept. The second game is where everything comes together. And the third game is like they've used up all their best ideas in the preceding game and are willing to put all sorts of weirdness in. Altered graphics, a soundtrack that is going in a bold new direction, bizarre upgrades or physics, and so on. This holds true for a lot of game franchises, including Mortal Kombat, Streets of Rage, Sonic, Mario, Virtua Fighter, Street Fighter to a lesser extent, Worms, Lemmings, the list goes on. I'm sure that there are a lot of people out there that would disagree with me, as there are some game franchises out there where the third is overwhelmingly better, but from my perspective of the 16-bit and early 32-bit era, it certainly seems to be the case. The 2D driving genre was only ever going to have a limited lifespan. With the arrival of games such as Virtua Racing, Daytona USA, Ridge Racer, Sega Rally, Carmageddon, Need for Speed and of course Gran Turismo, the third dimension and CD technology bought a place together in the neighbourhood, moved in and remain here to stay. Well, until 3D had an affair with digital distribution and physical media was forced to move out, but I think I've laboured this metaphor enough now. I would wager that most of today's youth would not spend more than a few minutes on these technically underwhelming games. as there is no way that they can even start to keep pace with more modern and advanced titles. But I would recommend giving them a go, and imagine old farts like me being awed by these games in the same way as Forza wows people today. The Lotus Turbo Challenge games were also released on the Atari ST and Sega Mega Drive/Genesis, but as is most often the case, the Amiga versions are vastly superior. In the case of the Gena Drive, it seems they mixed the Lotuses 2 and 3 together, calling it Lotus Turbo Challenge 2, but with the M200 concept and 3 thrown in along with the format and many of the Lotus 3 tracks. Consistency across the brands was not a strong point. When it comes to the Trilogy on the Amiga, we can employ the old 80-20 rule. 20% of the time, I might load up Lotus 1 or 3. But after a few minutes, usually default to Lotus 2, where I definitely spend 80+% of the time with this series of games. It is not just better than the other two, but stands as one of the best driving games available on the Amiga, despite its basic premise. I'm the eager Amiga Eagle. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would be eternally grateful if you would like and subscribe, and check out the other videos that I've uploaded. See you next game! With the triumphant "Yeehaw!" when you do. God, that sounded so lame.